Good afternoon, everyone. I'd welcome you all to News Platform for a discussion today on whether India is ready for a minimum basic income. Even before the corona pandemic hit, India's unemployment was at a 45-year high. But now, 12 crore jobs have been lost and lakhs of migrants are returning home even as we speak, with a genuine fear that they might not return. Additionally, the income of an average Indian has taken a serious hit, with real wages dropping significantly in 2019 for the first time in 6 years. With the lockdown, it has nosedived to unprecedented levels. This has severely dented consumption, which accounts for nearly 57% of our GDP. In fact, even before the pandemic hit, consumer spending in 2018 fell for the first time in 4 decades. And now, back to back lockdowns have sent the economy on a downward spiral. Amidst this consumption slump, several economists have urged the government to put money into people's hands, to help them stay afloat, and to kickstart the economy. As India hurtles towards the worst recession she's ever faced, there are a number of questions we all have. Is the NDA government doing enough? Are the states doing enough? If not, what more needs to be done? To answer some of these questions, we are very privileged to have with us Praveen Chakravarty ji, Chairperson of the Congress's Data Analytics Department, Rakshita Swamy ma'am from the Social Accountability Forum for Action and Research based out of NLS Bengaluru, and Professor Dreze, renowned economist, author, and activist. I'd like to begin with you, Professor Dreze. You have been associated with a lot of people's movements and you have worked extensively on the ground. The NDA government vehemently argues that its PM Kisan scheme, PM's Garib Kalyan Yojana, and the Atmanirbhar package have helped alleviate distress in both urban and rural India. They also claim that demand is one of the key pillars of their package and that it provides for a social safety net. I'd like to know if you agree with that, and could you also elaborate a little bit more about what is happening on the ground, because we have all been kept in the dark by the mainstream media about it.
Well, I think that anyone's observations on the ground, as you call them, at this time, are bound to be somewhat limited because we can't move around much. In my case, I can say something about my observations in one district of Jharkhand. And of course, we also have a number of informal telephone surveys that tell us something about the larger picture. What is keeping most people alive today, as I perceive it, is first and foremost the public distribution system. I think the one good thing that the central government has done so far is the doubling of food rations for an initial period of 3 months. In Jharkhand, about 90% of poor households would have a ration card and benefit from this. And recent surveys like the Azim Premji University survey also suggest that something like 85 to 90% of households, of poor households rather, in India as a whole benefit from these double rations. So I think this is really what is keeping people alive today. We have to recognize that. And that is what makes it extremely important to continue this doubling of food rations beyond the initial period of 3 months. And of course also to extend the coverage of the PDS, because about 500 million people today in India don't have a ration card. Not all of them are poor, but a significant proportion of them are poor. And today they are the most vulnerable households. Aside from that, a significant number of women receive 500 rupees per month in their JDY account. It's not much at all, of course, very insufficient. It does make a difference to them, so it is better than nothing. But what is going to enable, hopefully, large numbers of people to earn a significant amount of income in the next few months is the Employment Guarantee Act. I think that is going to be the only significant source of employment for large numbers of people. And so once again, it's important to look at this as a very critical opportunity. Some states, some leading states that have relatively better prepared system like Chhattisgarh, Rajasthan, and Tamil Nadu are already deploying the employment guarantee scheme on a large scale and employing millions of people. But I think what is very important is to extend that, especially to the poorer states, which unfortunately are not so well prepared. I think these are the big relief efforts at the moment that need attention and consolidation.
Right, sir. Rakshita ji, from what Professor Dreze has been saying, Manrega is one of the aspects that requires immediate attention. But in addition, you have been auditing various social sector schemes across India, and now the government has said that it has enhanced collateral-free lending to self-help groups from rupees 10 lakh to 20 lakh, and it would benefit 7 crore households. So, do you think that this will provide any immediate relief? And what have been your observations regarding this?
So any kind of assistance to self-help groups and federations are helpful, but it begs the question of who are you trying to help? So if we try to look at are really the most vulnerable communities, most marginalized, most in need for food and work, are they members of SAGs? The answer to that question is open out there. There are a lot of independent studies which state that that's not the case. And also adding to what Jean had pointed out, it's the necessity and the requirement as of today, immediate, is cash paid through wages, preferably of NREGA and ration. And the second order gains of easier access to credit and through that income generation activities are definitely something that those are good initiatives, but are they the most urgently needed at this point of time by those who are worst affected by the crisis? I don't think so. But particularly with NREGA, there is the additional allocation of 40,000 crores is definitely a good and positive development, and something that was owed to NREGA even under normal circumstances, but clearly it took a pandemic to release the kind of funds that NREGA needed. But at least for the next 2 to 3 months, there are adequate financial resources available with state governments to actually implement NREGA in a way that it can offer itself as a credible means of support for people who need work. And for that, like many people like Jean and networks like People's Action Employment Guarantee and other campaigns have been constantly advocating that processes for NREGA be kept simple so that at this point of time, don't complicate a program, don't overload it with objectives and goals that you couldn't do through any other program in the past and now you want to laden it all with, but keep it simple so that it's able to respond quickest.
Praveen ji, you have designed the Congress Party's Nyay scheme, which is a direct cash transfer. So, in addition to Manrega, do you think enhancing Manrega works would be enough, or do you think that the time is now right for a minimum income guarantee? And if Nyay were in fact to be brought today in some form, will it cover a lot more than 20% of the population?
Sure. See, I want to start by saying, I would differ a lot to people like Professor Dreze, who know a lot more about this and who've experienced a lot of these on the ground in terms of what works best during such times of distress. Now, I think it's important not to conflate the idea of a minimum income, a basic income, with what we need today, which is rescue and recovery options, both for people, livelihoods, as well as I would go and say that we would need it for the supply side, as they call it in economic terms, which is the businesses. But so I want to separate the two. I think Nyay, at the time it was conceptualized, was supposed to be a program that was moving India towards some sort of a basic income framework and a paradigm. And that meant regular income streams, and we can debate what is the amount of income, how many people it should cover, and all of that. But right now, I do not think we must mix the two. What we need immediately is cash, certainly cash assistance, and as we have seen, yes, PDS and NREGA very, very helpful. In fact, even in some of our own letters that we wrote to the Prime Minister as a party, even some of the official proposals that we have put out, we have very strongly advocated enhancing Mahatma Gandhi NREGA. Having said that, we must also acknowledge that, you know, while we are facing this whole entire migrant issue, perhaps cash would have been the more appropriate response for that crisis, because either dry ration or a Mahatma Gandhi NREGA scheme would not have been helpful for that particular issue. So I think cash does have a role. By no means am I suggesting that it should be a replacement for any of these. I think first and foremost, I completely agree with Professor Dreze, food, livelihood, which is a source of incomes, and then cash for people that cannot really access the first two, and perhaps to more people.
Right. So, taking that point, Professor Dreze, do you think that a right balance can be struck between giving cash transfers and also ensuring food, fuel, and fertilizer subsidies? What do you think a right balance for all of this would be, given our Indian context?
I think a balance can be struck, but I'm not sure that Nyaya is the way to do it, at least Nyaya as it has been conveyed so far. In fact, I think we really need more clarity about what this Nyaya exactly means and how it will work. In the initial formulation, it was what you might call a top-up income. In other words, the idea is that there would be a minimum income, let's say 12,000 rupees a month or 6,000 rupees a month, and then you will fill the gap between that and people's actual income. That is relatively affordable if it can work, but I just don't understand how it can be made practical. I mean, how are you going to identify these people who are below the threshold, and how are you going to measure the gap? I just don't think it can work. And so there was a shift later on to something that is more practical, which is a flat 6,000 rupees per month to 20% of the population. That is a little bit more comprehensible. It becomes a little bit like a pension. But the question still remains, how are you going to identify these 20% of the population? And I think the other issue with that is that it can be very divisive, because, you know, it's a sad truth that 6,000 rupees a month, many people would regard as a substantial income. I mean, it's more than many people earn in the informal sector in jobs like being a chowkidar or a domestic worker. And so you can imagine the kind of demand that there will be for this pension. And if you are not able to identify with any kind of accuracy these poorest 20%, and I think that is bound to be the case, there are bound to be huge inclusion and exclusion errors, then you are going to create a very divisive system where a minority of imperfectly identified people have this pension, which is more than the salary of many others who are working, and then other people are left out. So I think this formula of 20% times 6,000 rupees a month, I don't think that is a very attractive formula. But that is not to say that I would be against cash transfers. In fact, I do support many kinds of cash transfers, including social security pensions. In fact, I would say that if it's like a pension, then why not start with the actual pensions and universalize pensions for the elderly and widows and disabled persons. So I would support some forms of large-scale cash transfer schemes, provided that they are practical and also that they are well integrated with the existing foundations of India's social security system, because India has reasonably sound foundations for a possible social security system, which include the PDS, NREGA, pensions, and then maternity benefits for pregnant women and children's programs like ICDS and midday meals. I think this is not a bad combination. And so we have to think of where the cash transfers will fit into that. Are they going to replace the food transfers or supplement them? Who is going to benefit from them? And also we have to make sure that the cost of the cash transfers doesn't displace the resources that are available for these other programs which have proved their worth and are already in place and helping huge numbers of people. So I would look for a form of large-scale cash transfer that fits into this existing framework, rather than set them aside and say, okay, let's go for 6,000 rupees a month for 20% of the population, because that sounds great, but I'm not very clear how it would actually work.
Right. Praveenji, would you like to respond to some of the concerns which Professor Dreze has raised?
Yes. At the risk of taking this nation back a year and starting to debate about the manifesto idea of Nyai, which perhaps is not appropriate at this point, I'm given the other problems you're facing, but I'm happy to explain. I think first and foremost, the idea of Nyai was to introduce the element of cash and cash transfers under basic income. Now, there are certain questions that Professor Dreze raised, and I'm happy to answer them. So the top-up, actually, it was never supposed to be, the way it was supposed to work was, it was never supposed to be like a top-up, in the sense, the top-up was what we had thought of at the back end. And let me explain that. How did we come up with the number 6,000 rupees? For that, we said, okay, and we can debate these numbers, but I'll at least explain what our thought process was at that time. We said 12,000 rupees a month is perhaps the minimum amount that every Indian family today in 21st century India should have for some sort of a basic living. Then we found out that 20% of India's households, on average, again it's an average, it's not perfect, so on average earn 6,000 rupees a month. So then that's how we came up with the number 6,000, which was actually the top up to 12,000. It was never meant to be going and identifying every household's income level and then topping up to the amount that it was possible. Now, to the second question of how will we identify people and inclusion exclusion errors, any program, any scheme, at least in today, that when the government of India introduced any program, take Ayushman Bharat for example, there is a certain cutoff. They say people earning below a certain amount are eligible for Ayushman Bharat. Or, I mean, the idea of a threshold is actually very common in most policy worlds. I mean, if you take income taxes, for example, why is it, if you say anyone that earns greater than 15 lakh rupees pays 30%, why, you can always argue why should someone earning 15 lakh and someone earning 50 lakh pay the same amount. I think that problem will always be there when you have any sort of threshold. But we cannot solve for individual problems. I think the idea broadly was to say 6,000 is the amount, the bottom 20% on average earn 6,000 rupees, and we will top them up. I think we repeatedly said, even during, even in the manifesto and during the campaign, that this will have to go through a lot of pilots. We will have to, once, if we are in government, we will have to go through various data sets, various lists, including state BPL lists, and we will start somewhere. And that was really the idea. I mean, I understand the Congress party is held to a higher standard, and implement, and people want implementation details right at the manifesto. But it was not possible to provide such detail because we were not in government. I thought the idea was to tell yes. the nation that we must move to a sort of a cash transfers. Idea of cash was important. Then the third question that Professor Jean Dreze raised, which is it was never supposed to be a replacement. It was never supposed to be replacement. And I think we've categorically said replacing a PDS or an NREGA or education or health with cash is not something that the party subscribes to.
Right. Rakshit, I would like to pick up on another point which Professor Dreze has said, and this talks about identification. A big problem is that with direct transfers or with PDS, it has to be done via Aadhaar. And now there are a lot of privacy and security concerns, but the important thing is that it can be also exclusionary. Now, isn't that a real problem, and how do we solve this issue, especially when so much reverse migration is happening and there could be a lot of, discrepancies in food distribution?
Sure. So Aadhaar was introduced as a technical mechanism to check corruption, to check pilferage. And there was this, it was not just the implementation of it, but it was the stated intent of it. So there are all kinds of contradictions, which I won't go into now. But the biggest, the most critical means in which it led to such widespread exclusion was the fact that it was never supposed to be mandatory. The government declared it was not supposed to be mandatory. The court declared it shouldn't be, but it was mandatory everywhere we saw it. And so this led to a series of issues in terms of implementation. Largely for NREGA, Aadhaar seeded bank accounts became a mandatory requirement for wages to be credited. For pension dispersal, biometric authentication became a mandatory requirement, and for ration offtake. So if you would go to your fair price shop, for you to take your food grains, you would have to authenticate through the POS machine. There have been documented, it's not anecdotal evidence anymore, but it's documented cases where actually Aadhaar has led to exclusion through multiple counts. The first big category in which it began was obviously in the seeding of bank accounts. There have been a host of bank accounts which have got left out. Payments under NREG, for instance, a state like Rajasthan, as of last financial year, had about 100 crores of rejected wage payments because of a discrepancy between an Aadhaar linking to a bank account. Then it resulted in, the first issue was basically the linking of the bank account with the Aadhaar. Then the second became about the actual authentication, the actual exercise of authentication. We've seen that manual workers, the elderly, the issues that they have with their fingerprints, the problem that led to in terms of nullifying an authentication and them being denied their actual entitlement, their actual right. And the third thing, of course, was the complete lack of, in terms of the penetration of electricity, penetration of internet connectivity has been extremely sporadic. It's not the same. It's not at all. And even in cities like Delhi, we've had places where PDS shops haven't been able to authenticate because they didn't have internet connectivity. So these were the four primary ways and means through which Aadhaar has contributed to exclusion of rightful beneficiaries from accessing their rightful entitlements. And unfortunately, the end towards which the Aadhaar was also moving towards, which was reduction in corruption, removing of pilferage, we have seen cases now when even that objective is not being met. Ways have been found by, all kinds of combinations have been worked out where it is possible to put in Aadhaar cards which are linked to the wrong bank accounts and seeded to the wrong fingerprint, and because of that, a lot of incorrect beneficiaries are taking their entitlements. And other mechanisms that are available that have shown to work, for example, public disclosure, public release of payments in public collective platforms in front of everybody, are actually not being relied on as much, whereas we've seen that they have a much greater propensity to serve that purpose.
Right. Professor Dreze, I'd like to come back to you. You have recommended that there should be a combination of food transfer and social security pensions. I would like to ask, where do we find the resources to fund this, and is there a role for the state government in financing the welfare schemes?
Yeah, If you allow me, I'll very briefly come back first to this whole business of identification, because it's really quite
Sure.
crucial to Nyai. If you don't have an idea of how you are going to identify these 20%, then I think Nyai is on a very, very fragile foundation. You see, we had a very bad experience for many years with the BPL approach, which was also trying to identify the poorest, about 1/3 in that case. And it was full of inclusion and exclusion errors. And because of that, in recent years, we moved to 3 other approaches. One is self-selection, in the case of Narega, for example, where people decide for themselves whether they want to work. Then there is universalization in some cases, for example, midday meal schemes, which are open to all children. And then what you might call the exclusion approach, where you exclude the top, like you say, those who have a 4-wheel vehicle, they pay income tax, or they have more than 5 acres of land, you exclude the top, and then everybody else is included. Those 3 approaches, which have their respective uses in different contexts, have worked reasonably well. But I think what is not very wise is to return to this hopeless effort to identify the poorest 20% or the poorest 30% based on very unreliable data set, all the more so because, people may be poor today and not tomorrow, or the reverse, so things keep changing. So it's really very difficult to identify in that way. About financing of social security, I would say, first of all, tax the rich. I mean, the rich are still paying very few taxes in India. That's something that the Indian public may not be sufficiently aware of. There's no wealth tax, there's no inheritance tax, there are low property taxes, and even the top income tax rates are very low. And of course, the income tax base is very narrow. I mean, it's barely 1% of the population, according to a recent statement of the Prime Minister himself. So there's quite a lot of scope for raising money through taxes, and I would say especially wealth taxes. I mean, you can raise quite a bit of money through a wealth tax in the reasonably short run to deal with a crisis like the crisis we are facing today. And also, in the same spirit, reduce subsidies to the well-off, because there are many subsidies, for example, electricity subsidies to the well-off, so-called middle classes, that could be reduced. So I think that there is a fair amount of scope for further revenue mobilization, especially, of course, if the economy continues to grow at a reasonable rate, which is not, unfortunately, guaranteed now by any means. But we can go much further than we have gone so far, I think, in providing social security. And I would say healthcare. I think healthcare is also part of the social security system. And one of the biggest missing, or the biggest gaps now in the system of social security as it exists today in India, is a sound and universal system of healthcare. So I think we have to move in that direction very quickly in the next few years.
Praveenji, would you like to perhaps talk about what Chhattisgarh is doing in its recently launched Nyay scheme, and any observations that you have from there?
No, I think the Chhattisgarh scheme is, while it's called Nyay, it's actually quite different from the original idea of cash transfers. It's more it is a cash transfer. It's a cash transfer, but to farmers, and I think it was perhaps a first attempt at some sort of cash transfers. I mean, I do want to keep going. I don't want to belabor on this point of identification, but as someone who comes from a data background, I will say that what we can do today in terms of ability to identify is a lot better than what we were able to do 5 years or 10 years ago. I only kind of half jokingly say, on one hand, political parties are accused of micro-targeting voters to the point of being able to manipulate their minds. That's the accusation. So if that is possible, then a certain amount of targeting. But I don't mean to belittle the problem of identification. I completely take on board that this is not easy. But at the same time, I will say that it is a lot more doable today than it was perhaps 5 years ago or 10 years ago. I mean, just last year, I think 145 million people for Narega were paid through their bank accounts, as per the report for Mahatma Gandhi Narega. So, which is significantly more than what we've seen earlier, and similarly in various schemes. So, there are various data sets that have started to become available, and there is an ability to link. But absolutely, point taken that identification is not easy, is not as easy as anybody thinks, and we did not think it was going to be easy. The other point about, I think I want to comment about Aadhaar, and and I mean, in the spirit of full disclosure, I was a member of the founding team at Aadhaar, but I've written publicly now that. Yes, I think it is proven that, at least in the Jharkhand empirical study done by Professor Karthik Muralidharan, I think it's very clear that it did not really reduce leakages in a significant manner, but more importantly, more troublesome was the fact that it denied food to 10% of genuine beneficiaries. That's a big problem, because that's just unacceptable. So I agree. I completely admit that. But sometimes I wonder if we let the problem become so large that we don't want to even go near trying to provide assistance. Take the case of migrants. The finance minister and the government of India's defense for not providing cash to migrants today is the same thing, the same problem that they cite, which is we don't know who they are. We don't have any database. We don't know the beneficiaries. And I think that is not an acceptable excuse for not providing assistance to migrants. So that's the limited point I'm making. I think not having data, not having lists, not being able to, having inclusion errors of identifying beneficiaries cannot be a reason for us, cannot be a sole reason for us to not do what perhaps is right and what perhaps the people need.
Right. Rakshita ji, I'd like to come to you now and ask, so the sense that I'm getting is that maybe India may not be ready for a universal basic income, but there is probably a middle path somewhere for a targeted income guarantee coupled with other benefits. So according to you, what do you think that should look like, given our situation today?
Sure. And actually there have been, this has been alluded to by Joe himself, and there have been groups that have been engaging with this issue. And we're really trying to steer the conversation from universal basic income to universal basic services, which is saying that all citizens should have access to healthcare, public healthcare. They should have access to an employment guarantee, not only in rural areas, but in urban areas. They should have a right to social security pension, and they should have right to subsidized food grains. So this would form the bedrock of the basic minimum services that people should have a right to. And cash transfers, anything in addition to, anything to supplement people's access to these services is definitely the middle path that we would like to traverse or negotiate through. And that is why it's to say that there will be universal basic income while protecting all of these entitlements, in terms of the finances that's going to involve are not two things that are adding up, which is why there's a lot of confusion and there's a lot of apprehension about just what exactly universal basic income would mean. So I would like to sort of conclude it by saying that I think we really need to start looking towards universal basic services and see where cash transfers and income transfers can get us towards there. And that's more important for now.
Professor Dreze, would you agree with Rakshita ji on this? And is there anything that you would like to add to this?
What I would add is that there is still a lot of work to do in consolidating and improving what is in place. This Narega, PDS, pensions, midday meals, ICDS, all these programs are still underfunded and could contribute much more than they are already doing. So I think that since one is almost bound in these matters to move in steps, I would begin, as far as cash transfers is concerned, with universalizing pension schemes, which are already in place, like the NSAP, universalizing or perhaps using what I call the exclusion approach, where you basically exclude those who have well-identified assets or other signs of prosperity, and then you cover everybody else. I would be happy with either of the two approaches. And then very importantly, I would implement maternity benefits as per the National Food Security Act, which is still not being done more than 5 years after the act came into force, and increase the benefits. You know, under the act, it's only 6,000 rupees per child, which is really too little. And then I think I would extend cash transfers to categories that are not at the moment in the existing pension schemes, but are well identified and consist overwhelmingly of very poor people. For example, what is called the particularly vulnerable tribal groups. I mean, these are officially recognized and well counted groups that are desperate for support. So I think I would move in steps in that way, and then in due course, when we can afford it, perhaps move towards something more broad-based and closer to universal. And then, of course, I would reiterate the importance of including universal healthcare in the social security framework, and spending much more money and resources of all kinds, not just financial resources, but also human resources and political resources, to make rapid strides towards a system of universal healthcare.
Thank you, sir. Yes. So my last question is to you. And what is the one or two measures that you recommend the NDA government right now to do immediately to solve the current problem that we are having?
I think there were three clear demands that the party officially has made, and I will reiterate those, which is, first and foremost, immediate cash assistance, specifically to migrants. It doesn't have to be through bank accounts, it doesn't have to be, but cash assistance to migrants, that needs to be done immediately. Second, free transportation for migrants to help them get back to their homes. And third, once they get back to their homes and villages, doubling Mahatma Gandhi Narega to 200 days immediately. So these are the three specific requests that we have placed for as a party to the government of India. But if you may permit, I want to ask a question to both of them, perhaps Professor Dreze, in terms of, in your interactions with over the years with people at the below poverty level, what do you think is their view on just getting cash assistance?
Yes. Professor Dreze, would you like to respond?
Well, I think there is considerable evidence, and this is also my own experience, that poor people much prefer food to cash because they are afraid of hunger, and having some food in the house gives an element of security in their lives. So I don't think there's any doubt that if you look at the poorer households, they are certainly not interested in giving up their food rations for cash. Now, it's certainly true also that when people become better off, they are less exposed to food insecurity, better educated, better able to use the banking system, then of course a point comes when people may well be fine with cash or even prefer it to food. I mean, if you ask me, I would probably prefer cash to food. Also because the cash enables them to buy the food of their choice. But what is interesting and almost surprising is that the level of income at which people still prefer food is pretty high. And that's one reason why the effort to move from food to cash in relatively prosperous places like Puducherry and Chandigarh have failed. Another important reason, of course, was all the glitches in the DBT payment system, which, by the way, is one of the most unreliable payment systems in the world. And I'm very surprised that the RBI allows it to continue without further scrutiny, but that's a different story. But the point I'm making is that it's not until people are pretty safe and well off that they seem to prefer cash to food. So I would be very, very cautious in any transition from food to cash. And also because we have to think about this a little bit politically. You see, you cannot deprive people of what they have, the little they have in terms of social support, unless you are very sure that you are giving them something better, and unless they also feel that they're getting something better. So I think we're still some distance away from that. And that is why I tend to defend the PDS, at least for the time being, without denying that a day may come when the technology works better and people are better prepared. And most importantly, food insecurity is not around anymore, so that at that time it may be appropriate to have cash transfers. But that's a long time, still quite a long time away in my view.
Yes. Quoting Victor Hugo, sir, Dr. Manmohan Singh once said in 91 that no force on earth can stop an idea whose time has come. But yet, during this unprecedented pandemic, when the status quo has completely changed, the NDA seems to be floundering. Whether it is expansion of PDS, whether it is expansion of NREGA, or introducing cash transfers, the NDA has been very lax in its approach. We are faced with a policy paralysis, and we really need to experiment with some out-of-the-box policy to ensure fullness of life for all Indians. I thank all my panelists for joining in, and thank you all for listening.